Apparently, the FDA wants to know what you're saying about cannabis on TikTok and Instagram and Reddit. Yes, the same FDA we normally associate with clinical trials, pharmaceutical approvals, laboratory data, and very serious people reading very serious reports. Now wants to listen to social media. And when I first read that headline, I'll admit I found it slightly amusing because if you're looking for reliable scientific information, Reddit would not necessarily be the first place I'd send you. But then I looked into what the FDA is actually asking for. And this became much more interesting. According to Marijuana Moment, the FDA is currently seeking an outside contractor to monitor conversations about marijuana and hemp products across platforms, including TikTok, Instagram, and Reddit. And they're not simply looking for how many times somebody says the word cannabis. The proposed monitoring would be capture it would capture information about products, ingredients, claims, consumer conditions, sentiment, and other characteristics of what people are discussing online. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The FDA also wants research involving actual dispensary customers. According to the same reporting, the agency wants a survey examining things like product preferences, desired effects, medical conditions, frequency and history of use, average purchases, and even preferred dosages. Now, that is fascinating because think about the information regulators normally have available to them: clinical studies, medical reports, laboratory testing, adverse event reporting, controlled research, all incredibly important, but none of those necessarily tell you how millions of people are actually talking about cannabis when nobody in a white coat is standing in the room. Social media does. And yes, obviously, social media also is full of absolute nonsense. People repeat things they heard from somebody who heard it from somebody else. An algorithm can take one ridiculous health claim and put it in front of 10 million people before breakfast, literally. So, no, TikTok comments should probably not replace clinical trials anytime soon, but that's not really what the FDA appears to be trying to do. The agency says its cannabis work involves developing cross agency strategy and policy around cannabis products. And this kind of social listening can potentially fill gaps in understanding how products are actually being discussed and used outside controlled settings. And that raises a question I genuinely don't know the answer to. What is more valuable when you're trying to understand real world customer behavior? Asking a few thousand people carefully designed questions or quietly observing millions of conversations people were already having? Because those two methods can give you very, very different pictures. In a survey, people know they're being studied. On Reddit, trust me, they usually behave like nobody's studying them at all. I mean, and sometimes that messiness is useful. Somebody might mention an unexpected effect, a product being used in a way regulators didn't anticipate, a dosage trend, a health claim suddenly spreading across TikTok, or a new cannabinoid becoming popular before traditional data sets even notice it. That's information. Not necessarily good information, not necessarily true information, but information nonetheless. And this is where I think the story becomes much bigger than cannabis, because governments are beginning to operate in a world where enormous amounts of real time human behavior are publicly observable. We voluntarily document what we buy, what we take, how it makes us feel, what we believe, what we're afraid of, and what somebody on TikTok convinced us to try last Tuesday. Researchers 20 years ago would have dreamed of having access to that kind of data set. Today, the problem isn't finding the information, it's figuring out which parts of it deserve to be believed. And that's the part I'd be watching because there is a very big difference between using social media to identify a question and using social media to answer one. If thousands of people suddenly start reporting the same unexpected experience, perhaps that's something worth investigating. But popularity doesn't turn an anecdote into scientific evidence. 10 million views don't make a medical claim. So maybe the real value of social media isn't that it tells regulators what to believe. Maybe it tells them what they should be asking about next. And that's really the shift. The FDA listening to cannabis conversations online sounds funny until you realize that TikTok, Instagram, Reddit, and platforms like them have become one of the largest continuously updating records of consumer behavior we've ever created. The question isn't whether there's useful information buried inside all that noise. There almost certainly is. The question is whether anyone can reliably separate the signal from the absolute chaos. Here's a sentence I genuinely didn't expect to say on this podcast. The United States Postal Service may soon be delivering cannabis. Yes, the same people bringing you your electricity bill, birthday cards, and the package you forgot you ordered 3 weeks ago could potentially be delivering medical cannabis directly to patients' homes. And no, cannabis has not suddenly become federally legal across America. We know that, like, that's no news. This is happening in Georgia, and the details are actually much more interesting than the headline. So, according to Cannabis Business Times, the Georgia Medical Cannabis Commission voted on August 13th to propose a rule allowing medical cannabis to be delivered through the United States Postal Service, as well as private carriers, including FedEx, UPS, and DHL. Georgia currently has more than 45,000 registered medical cannabis patients. And the proposal would allow licensed dispensaries to ship directly to registered patients, caregivers, and certain healthcare institutions within the state. Now, before anyone starts waiting beside their mailbox, this is still a proposal. The rule is open for public comment, and Georgia regulators are expected to consider it at a public hearing on September 16th. But I think the fact that we're even having this conversation is remarkable because I think that, like, think about how bizarre the relationship between cannabis and the federal government has been historically. And now we're discussing whether a federal agency, the United States Postal Service, could become part of the infrastructure delivering medical cannabis to patients. That's quite a sentence. But here's where I think this becomes genuinely interesting. Georgia regulators aren't presenting this as some revolutionary new cannabis experience. They're talking about access. Andrew Turnage, the executive director of Georgia's Medical Cannabis Commission, explained that Georgia is geographically large and that patients have struggled to access the medication the state regulates. His argument is essentially very simple. Why make a registered patient drive several hours if their medication can safely come to them? And suddenly, the question becomes uncomfortable in a very interesting way. If we're going to call cannabis medicine, should we also start treating it like medicine? Because Americans already receive prescription medications through the mail. That's completely normal. Nobody sees a pharmaceutical package arrive and thinks, my God, the Postal Service has entered the drug trade. We understand the distinction. It's medication, it's regulated, it's going to a patient. So if medical cannabis is legally recognized within a regulated medical system, why should the delivery mechanism automatically be different? But there is another side to this. Cannabis isn't an ordinary prescription medication under federal law. And putting an intoxicating controlled substance into the mail obviously creates questions. Who receives the package? How do you verify them? What happens if it's delivered to the wrong address? How do you prevent diversion? Georgia's proposal tries to answer some of those questions. Reporting on the proposed rule says shipments would require certified mail or an equivalent service, tracking identity and patient registry verification, and a signature from the authorized recipient. And there's another extremely important limitation. We're not talking about somebody in Georgia ordering cannabis from California. The proposal is specifically about Georgia dispensaries shipping to registered Georgia patients inside Georgia itself. Interstate commerce is an entirely different conversation. But this is why I find this story so interesting. Cannabis policy usually changes through enormous announcements, legalization, rescheduling, new legislation, but sometimes the more important changes are incredibly mundane. Can it go in the mail? Can a pharmacy dispense it? Can a doctor prescribe it? Can insurance eventually cover it? Those questions aren't particularly glamorous, but they're the questions that determine whether something actually functions like medicine in everyday life. So here's a question I would leave you with. If cannabis is going to occupy a legitimate place in medicine, at what point should we stop building an entirely separate system around it? And at what point should it simply start using the infrastructure that medicine already has? I don't know exactly where that line should be, but Georgia may be about to test it. And that's really the shift. The remarkable part isn't that cannabis could arrive in someone's mailbox. The remarkable part is that we're reaching a point where, for a registered patient receiving regulated medication, that idea might eventually stop sounding remarkable at all. I want to finish today's episode with something slightly uncomfortable because on this show, we've talked about cannabis becoming medicine. We've talked about cannabis beverages. We've talked about changing consumer attitudes. We've talked about access. We've talked about normalization. So I think it's only fair that when research comes out suggesting something we may not particularly want to hear, we talk about that too. And this one definitely got my attention. So, researchers from the University of Cambridge recently conducted one of the largest analyses ever looking at recreational drug use and stroke risk. According to the University of Cambridge, the researchers combined evidence from 32 previous studies involving more than 100 million people. And among the substances they examined was cannabis. The result, cannabis use was associated with approximately a 37% higher risk of stroke. Now, before somebody clips that sentence and we all start screaming at each other on the internet, let's actually talk about what it means, because 37% higher risk doesn't mean 30% of cannabis consumers are going to have a stroke. That's not what relative risk means. And an association also doesn't automatically prove that cannabis directly caused every additional strokes observed in these studies. The researchers themselves noted substantial differences between the studies they analyzed and potential limitations in parts of the observational evidence, but they didn't stop with observational studies. They also used something called Mendelian randomization. Very simply, this uses genetic variants associated with certain behaviors or disorders to help researchers investigate whether an observed relationship may actually be causal, rather than simply being explained by other lifestyle factors. And according to the researchers, genetic liability to cannabis use disorder was associated with an increased risk of stroke overall, particularly large artery stroke. So, no, this isn't something I think we should casually dismiss. But I also don't think the responsible headline is cannabis causes strokes. No, science is usually much less satisfying than that. It gives us evidence, then better evidence, then conflicting evidence, then another study, and eventually, hopefully, a clearer picture. In fact, previous research on cannabis and cardiovascular risk hasn't always produced identical conclusions. Some studies have found increased cardiovascular risks, while others have struggled to establish significant associations once other factors are considered. And that's precisely why studies this large matter. They add another piece to the puzzle. But here's what I find particularly interesting about the reaction to stories like this. Cannabis has spent decades trapped between two completely ridiculous extremes. On one side, cannabis was portrayed as this uniquely dangerous substance that would apparently destroy society. On the other, you occasionally hear cannabis discussed as though because it's a plant, it must somehow be harmless. Why do we need either extreme? Alcohol can be enjoyable and harmful. Prescription medication can save your life and save serious side effects. Caffeine has benefits and risks. We seem perfectly capable of holding two ideas in our heads at the same time with almost everything else. So, why does cannabis have to be either miracle medicine or public enemy number one? Maybe normalization actually means allowing cannabis to become boring enough that we can discuss it honestly. Benefits where the evidence supports benefits, risks where the evidence supports risks, and uncertainty where the science simply isn't finished yet. Because if cannabis really is becoming part of mainstream medicine, consumer culture, and everyday life, then research like this becomes more important, not less. We should want to know what long term frequent use does. We should want to know whether dosage matters, whether the method of consumption matters, whether THC concentration matters, whether age matters, whether cardiovascular conditions change the equation. Those aren't anti cannabis questions, they're scientific questions. And personally, I think an industry becoming normalized should make those questions at least easier to ask, not harder. So here's the question I'd leave you with today. Are we finally mature enough to have a cannabis conversation where good news doesn't automatically make you pro cannabis and bad news automatically makes you anti cannabis? Because that's the conversation I'm much more interested in. And that's really the shift. Maybe true cannabis normalization isn't when everybody accepts cannabis. Maybe it's when we stop needing cannabis to be either completely good or completely bad and simply start demanding the best evidence we can get.